Nestled in the heart of the French Quarter in New Orleans stands one of America's most notorious haunted houses, LaLaurie Mansion. Its dark history, shrouded in whispers of unspeakable cruelty and paranormal activity, attracted none other than Hollywood actor Nicolas Cage, who purchased the property in 2007. What Cage didn't realize was that the house would become more than a unique addition to his real estate collection. It would thrust him into the heart of its chilling legacy. In the early 19th century, the mansion belonged to Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a socialite with a sinister secret. Beneath the facade of wealth and charm lay a cruel, twisted woman infamous for torturing her enslaved servants. When a fire broke out in 1834, the horrific truth was exposed. Several enslaved people were found in a locked attic, bound and subjected to unimaginable suffering. Many died in that wretched room, their spirits reportedly trapped within the walls of the mansion ever since. After the fire, the mansion gained a reputation for being cursed. Residents claimed to hear agonized screams echoing at night, doors slamming shut without explanation, and ghostly figures drifting through the halls. No one stayed for long. When Nicolas Cage purchased the mansion, he admitted to being drawn to its infamy, calling it a piece of history and the most haunted house in America. But he soon discovered that its history wasn't just something to read about, it came alive. Shortly after moving in, Cage reported eerie experiences. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, whispers followed him up the grand staircase, and cold spots lingered in the rooms. The most disturbing event came one night when he awoke to the sound of muffled cries. Following the noise, he ended up in the attic, where his flashlight flickered, revealing what he described as shadowy figures watching from the corners. Cage's guests experienced their own brushes with the supernatural. Several visitors complained of feeling invisible hands pulling at their clothing. A housekeeper reportedly quit after seeing an apparition of a woman in a dark gown standing at the window, a figure eerily resembling Madame LaLaurie herself. The mansion seemed to curse Cage's life in unexpected ways. His financial troubles escalated shortly after buying the property, and his once thriving acting career hit a rocky patch. Coincidence, some said, but locals whispered it was the curse of LaLaurie, punishing him for disturbing her domain. In 2009, Cage lost the mansion to foreclosure, and it was quickly sold off to an undisclosed buyer. Though he publicly downplayed the paranormal stories, insiders say Cage spoke privately about never wanting to set foot in the house again. The LaLaurie mansion remains closed to the public, and its current owners are secretive about their experiences. However, locals swear that the house still exudes an oppressive energy. Tourists passing by on ghost tours claim to see shadowy figures in the windows and hear faint cries late at night. Some believe that the spirits of LaLaurie's victims remain trapped, reliving their torment in an endless loop. And perhaps, for a brief moment, Nicolas Cage became part of their macabre story, a fleeting chapter in the unending horrors of the LaLaurie mansion. Though Nicolas Cage left the LaLaurie mansion behind, his time within its cursed walls seemed to leave a mark on him and perhaps on the house itself. In interviews following the foreclosure, Cage hinted at experiences he couldn't quite explain but never fully elaborated. Insiders claimed that he refused to discuss the mansion publicly, as if the very mention of it might reignite whatever dark energy he had encountered. But rumors continued to swirl. A leaked account from one of Cage's former assistants described a particularly harrowing night. The assistant claimed that during a small gathering, Cage became agitated, insisting he could hear someone screaming upstairs. When the others insisted they heard nothing, he reportedly stormed off to the attic. Moments later, a crash echoed through the house, and the group found Cage sprawled on the floor, his face pale, muttering, "She's still here." Long after Cage departed, the mansion continued to radiate its malevolence. Workers hired by the new owners spoke of tools disappearing, icy drafts sweeping through sealed-off rooms, and faint whispers that seemed to follow them throughout the house. One contractor swore he saw a pair of ghostly eyes watching him from a cracked mirror in the parlor, only to vanish when he turned around. The attic, however, remained the epicenter of the hauntings. Paranormal investigators who attempted to document the mansion's activity reported a near-unbearable pressure as they ascended the stairs. Equipment malfunctioned, batteries drained inexplicably, and some investigators felt faint or nauseous upon entering the room. One chilling account came from a local historian who was granted access to the house for research. She claimed to have uncovered records suggesting that not all of Madame LaLaurie's victims were accounted for after the fire. Some, she theorized, may have been buried beneath the house itself, their restless spirits further fueling the paranormal activity. The mansion's latest owners, despite their desire for privacy, allegedly initiated renovations in 2023. During this process, workers unearthed something unsettling beneath the floorboards in one of the upstairs bedrooms. A small, crudely carved doll made of bones and cloth, with strange symbols scrawled across its fabric. Experts suggested it could be a gree-gree, a type of voodoo charm, possibly left as a protection or a curse. Shortly after the discovery, the workers refused to continue. They spoke of hearing faint voices chanting in a language none of them recognized, and one even claimed to see a pale, childlike figure darting between the rooms. What was most disturbing, however, were the whispered stories about Cage's later years. Despite his silence on the matter, those close to him claimed he still had vivid nightmares of the mansion. Some said he dreamed of being trapped in the attic, unable to breathe, as shadowy hands clawed at him from the darkness. Others suggested he became obsessed with researching Madame LaLaurie, as if trying to make sense of what he had experienced. And then there was the photo. Circulating on obscure paranormal forums, the image reportedly showed Cage standing in front of the mansion shortly before he sold it. Behind him, barely visible in the upstairs window, was a blurred figure in a dark dress with sunken eyes, a figure eerily similar to descriptions of Madame LaLaurie herself. What happened during those final nights before he abandoned the house? And why does the mansion's sinister energy seem to persist, growing darker with each passing year? The full story remains locked away, much like the secrets of the attic, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to venture inside. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The mansion, now standing in eerie silence, seemed to grow more defiant with time. Its shutters would rattle violently on windless nights, and the air around the property carried a heaviness that made even seasoned locals cross the street rather than walk by. Some began to whisper that the house had developed a consciousness of its own, a malignant presence feeding on fear, sorrow, and curiosity. In 2024, the new owners, wealthy but secretive individuals rumored to dabble in the occult, decided to invite a renowned paranormal team to investigate the property. They sought not only to document the activity but to uncover the source of the mansion's malevolence. The team arrived with state-of-the-art equipment, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and specialized microphones designed to pick up even the faintest whispers of the unseen. The lead investigator, Dr. Evelyn Marks, was a no-nonsense skeptic with years of experience debunking so-called haunted locations. She intended to do the same with LaLaurie Mansion. On the first night, the team set up their base in the grand ballroom, a room eerily untouched by time. Despite its ornate chandeliers and polished floors, the air was unnervingly cold. As they calibrated their equipment, faint footsteps echoed from the hallway, steady, deliberate, and approaching. Dr. Marks called out, expecting to find one of her team members, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped just outside the ballroom door. When she opened it, she was met with an empty corridor and the distinct smell of charred wood and burned flesh. As the hours passed, the team began to experience phenomena they couldn't explain. Thermal cameras captured fleeting, humanoid shapes darting across the attic, despite the room being empty. Audio recorders picked up faint, agonized wails that grew louder the closer they were to the attic stairs. Then came the voice. One of the junior investigators, a man named Sam, froze during a routine EVP session in the upstairs hallway. His face went pale as he stared into the dark void of the attic door. When asked what was wrong, he whispered, "She's calling me." Before anyone could stop him, Sam began walking toward the attic. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as though he were being pulled by an unseen force. The team rushed to grab him, but as they did, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. It took nearly 10 minutes to pry the door open. Inside, they found Sam standing in the center of the room, staring at the floor. His voice was low and monotone as he muttered the same phrase repeatedly. "They're still here." When they finally pulled him out, Sam collapsed, trembling and unable to explain what had happened. But the footage from his body camera told a chilling story. The body cam showed Sam entering the attic alone. As he crossed the threshold, the camera's temperature gauge dropped sharply, and the screen flickered with static. A faint, raspy voice was audible, whispering his name, "Samuel, Samuel." The screen then went dark for several seconds, and when it returned, shadowy figures surrounded him. They were barely visible, their forms shifting as though they were made of smoke. One of them stepped forward, its hand outstretched, and the whisper grew louder. "Stay with us." The footage ended abruptly as the camera cut out entirely. That night, Dr. Marks reviewed historical records unearthed during her research. Among them was a list of Madame LaLaurie's known victims. What stopped her cold was the name of a young boy, aged 14, who had disappeared from the mansion in 1833. His name was Samuel. Was the house recreating its torments, luring the living into the roles of the dead? Or had something even darker taken root in the mansion, something that transcended time? The team decided to leave the house the next morning, but something about the attic seemed to cling to them. Their cameras malfunctioned, their vehicles wouldn't start, and one of the investigators woke in the middle of the night screaming about eyes watching from the walls, and as they finally drove away, one of them turned back for a final glance. Standing in the attic window, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was the unmistakable figure of a woman in a dark dress, her hollow eyes following them as they disappeared into the night. Dr. Marks vowed never to speak of the investigation again, but rumors of her notes and recordings persist. Paranormal enthusiasts claim to have seen glimpses of the footage online only for it to vanish mysteriously shortly after. And the mansion? It still stands, silent and watching, as if waiting for the next soul to cross its threshold. Because, as some say, the LaLaurie mansion doesn't just house ghosts, it creates them. Months after the investigation, strange occurrences began to ripple through the French Quarter. Nearby residents reported hearing low, mournful cries drifting from the direction of the LaLaurie mansion, even when the windows were boarded shut. Streetlights would flicker and die near the house, plunging the block into an unnatural darkness. Animals, dogs, cats, even birds avoided the property entirely, their reactions primal, as though sensing something deeply wrong. Dr. Evelyn Marks, despite her vow to stay silent, found herself unable to let go of what she had seen. The image of the shadowy figures surrounding Sam haunted her dreams. Worse, she began to notice strange phenomena in her own home. Objects moving on their own, mirrors fogging up with no explanation, and faint whispers echoing in empty rooms. At first, she dismissed these incidents as stress-induced, until one night, she awoke to find her attic door wide open, a door she hadn't opened in years. Inside, etched faintly into the dusty floorboards, was a symbol she recognized from the LaLaurie mansion. Desperate for answers, Dr. Marks reached out to an expert in occult symbols, a reclusive historian named Victor Beaumont. When she showed him a photograph of the symbol, his face turned pale. He explained that the design was an ancient sigil believed to tether spirits to a location, preventing them from moving on. Whoever carved this, Beaumont said gravely, intended to trap something there, something that should have been left to rest. Dr. Marks pressed him for more details, but Beaumont hesitated, his voice faltering. Finally, he admitted that the symbol wasn't just for binding, it could also be used to summon. And judging by the reports surrounding the LaLaurie mansion, he feared the summoning wasn't over. Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Marks returned to New Orleans. Though reluctant, she convinced the mansion's new owners to grant her one final access under the guise of conducting more historical research. She arrived armed with Victor Beaumont's notes, determined to locate the original sigil and put an end to whatever horror was stirring. The house seemed more alive than ever. As she entered, she felt the walls vibrate faintly, as if the structure were breathing. The air was thick, oppressive, and carried a metallic tang that reminded her of blood. Her search led her to a previously sealed-off room on the second floor, one not marked on any of the original blueprints. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches, as though something or someone had tried to claw their way out. At the center of the room was a faint outline of the sigil, partially hidden beneath layers of grime and debris. As Dr. Marks knelt to examine it, the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting so rapidly that her breath became visible. Then came the whisper, a low, guttural voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You shouldn't be here." Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The whisper grew louder, evolving into a chorus of anguished voices, all speaking over one another in a cacophony of rage and despair. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the room. In the shadows, something moved. At first, it was a vague, amorphous shape, but as her eyes adjusted, it took form. A figure, tall and skeletal, emerged from the darkness, its face obscured but its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The voices seemed to emanate from it, their collective pain radiating through the room. Dr. Marks stumbled backward, clutching Victor's notes as if they were a shield. The figure reached out, its bony hand inches from her face, when a sudden gust of wind tore through the room, scattering debris and extinguishing her flashlight entirely. In the pitch-black silence that followed, a single voice broke through the darkness. "She's not done with us." Dr. Marks woke hours later on the front steps of the mansion, disoriented and clutching the torn remnants of her notes. The sigil, now glowing faintly, burned in her mind. Whatever force resided in the Lalaurie mansion was growing stronger, its reach extending beyond the house itself. Back in her hotel room, she found a message scrawled across her bathroom mirror in a dripping, red substance that wasn't paint. "You brought her back." What or who had Dr. Marks accidentally unleashed? And why did the mansion seem more active than ever before, as if the house itself were preparing for something? The Lalaurie mansion's true horror was only just beginning to reveal itself, and for those connected to it, escape might no longer be an option. The Lalaurie mansion stood ominously against the New Orleans skyline, its windows dark, like eyes watching in silence. As Dr. Evelyn Marks paced the floor of her hotel room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line that could never be undone. The whispers that had haunted her were only growing louder, and the vision of that shadowy figure in the room was seared into her mind. She had awoken something that had been buried for over a century, and now it was stirring in ways she couldn't yet understand. Desperate for answers, Dr. Marks turned to Victor Beaumont for guidance. He agreed to meet her, warning that the entity in the mansion was not something of this world, but something tied to the deepest and darkest corners of human suffering, a force born from the unrelenting torment Madame Lalaurie had inflicted upon her victims. The sigil, Beaumont explained, wasn't just to trap the souls of her victims. It was a doorway, a thin veil between our world and something much older. Madame Lalaurie didn't just seek power, she sought to summon an entity that could grant her immortality. But it came with a cost. The entity wasn't bound by time, and over the years, it had grown stronger, feeding off the pain, fear, and the souls trapped within the mansion. Now, with the sigil disturbed and the veil weakening, the entity was waking up, and it was angry. When Dr. Marks returned to the mansion with Beaumont in tow, the house seemed to resist them. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, and even the bravest of their team was on edge. The mansion creaked and groaned as though it were alive and aware of their presence. Beaumont led them up to the second floor, where they had discovered the hidden room. This time, the sigil was glowing faintly beneath the grime and dust, as though it were alive, pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Dr. Marks's neck stand on end. The walls were still scratched with marks, and the room felt colder than ever before. "This is it," Beaumont whispered. "The doorway is here. It needs to be sealed before it can consume everything." But before they could act, the air grew heavier, and the whispers began again, louder, more frantic. The shadowy figure from Dr. Marks's previous encounter reappeared, its outline emerging from the darkness in the far corner of the room. Its eyes glowed like coals, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally. As it stepped forward, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You dare interfere?" Beaumont raised his hands, muttering incantations in a language Dr. Marks didn't recognize. But the figure laughed, a sound that rattled the very foundation of the house. The sigil on the floor flared, brighter and more intense than before, and a dark force surged through the walls, knocking them both to the ground. Dr. Marks struggled to stand, her heart racing. The entity's presence was overwhelming now, its shadow swallowing the room. She knew Beaumont's attempts to banish it weren't working. She had no choice but to follow the only lead they had, the sigil. "Victor!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. "We need to reverse it. We need to undo the summoning." Beaumont, now gasping for breath, nodded grimly. "It can be done, but it will require a sacrifice. We need to bind the entity back to the house, sealing it forever. If we fail, if the sigil is incomplete, it will consume everything in its path." The shadow figure lunged toward them, its eyes burning with fury. Dr. Marks knew they had only one shot. As the entity neared, she grabbed a piece of broken glass from the floor and began to trace the counter-sigil over the existing one, drawing with trembling hands. She recited the incantations Beaumont had taught her, her voice quivering with fear. The house seemed to come alive as the sigil pulsed and cracked under her touch. The ground shook, the air grew thick with an unnatural force. The shadows in the room writhed, fighting against her efforts to seal the entity away. Then, with a violent force, the sigil flared one last time. The entity screamed, a sound so terrible it seemed to pierce through every corner of the house. The walls cracked, the ceiling trembled, and the very foundation of the mansion groaned in protest. For a moment, it felt as if the entire mansion was about to collapse in on itself. But then, as quickly as it had begun, everything fell silent. The shadows receded, the room grew still, and the temperature returned to normal. The sigil on the floor had disappeared, leaving only the faintest trace of its former glow. Dr. Marks and Beaumont stood in the center of the room, breathless and trembling. The house was still standing, but its oppressive energy had vanished. The mansion had returned to a ghostly silence, but they knew the danger had not entirely passed. As they left the mansion, Dr. Marks cast one last glance over her shoulder. The windows, once dark and empty, now reflected the setting sun in an eerie way, as though something were watching from within. "I thought it was over," Dr. Marks said, her voice barely a whisper. Beaumont shook his head. "For now. But the house, it will always remember." And though the Lalaurie mansion had been sealed for the moment, its curse was not truly broken. The spirits of its victims still lingered, and the house itself remained a dark, twisted reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. As for the entity, some say it waits, silent, patient, hungry. The end, for now. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.